Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I am delighted to welcome Dr. Tarek Elgawhary. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
It's a great pleasure and honor to host you, actually. For those who don't know, Dr. Tarek is a teacher, writer, and scholar of comparative religions and Islamic studies. He's the founder of the Making Sense of Islam platform, dedicated to developing tools to help Muslims connect and be present with their beliefs and daily practices. He's currently serving as the General Director of the Royal Al Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought in Amman in Jordan. Also, he's a professor of Shelby Foote at the Wise University, also the US representative for the General Secretariat for Fatwa Authorities Worldwide, and the scholar in residence of the Islamic Community Center of Potomac, which is in Washington in the United States, where you are now, I think. In these various capacities, he teaches, lectures, and writes about normative Sunni Islam and how it is expressed and practiced in the modern world. Tarek's educational background, he says, is a bit unorthodox and eclectic. He spent his Western education in the space of comparative religions, having earned a BA in comparative religions with a focus on Jewish studies, and an MA in a specialized program focusing on Islam and Hinduism, both from the George Washington University. His graduate studies culminated with his PhD from Princeton University in Islamic law. Tarek was also trained at the Al-Azhar Seminary in Cairo, in Egypt, between 2003 and 2007, where he studied and was licensed in the traditional Islamic sciences. So it's quite a biography. So this is a program, a podcast dedicated to our shared love of Shakespeare, his poetry, his plays, his seminal influence. But the question we must ask, and also his relevance to his connection with Islam. Is there any connectivity between the works of Shakespeare and Islam? And I believe there are, and we'll hear what you think as well. But the question is really, why today in 2024 should we read Shakespeare at all? Why should we read his plays or watch them or enjoy his sonnets? Because he was a poet as well. What's your view, Tarek, on that?
Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. I mean, that is the big question, why Shakespeare? A lot of people today might find the English inaccessible, might find arcane, some of the vocabulary difficult. But when you get into Shakespeare, I think there are three main things for me. The first is he is a master of what we use today, or what we call today the English language. And I mean, I'm not an expert in poetic meter, but the basic structure of iambic pentameter and how it just comes across, especially in some of his earlier plays, the more historic plays, which are not the famous and maybe not the best of his plays, but still some of those long passages, they're almost like just music. You could even put a beat to it, the way that the language flows. And because of that, once you get into the structure of the language, I think it's very impactful. The second thing is a lot of his phrases and a lot of his turn of phrases and how he describes things are what we use today. Like, I did not know that a rain of bullets was something that came from Shakespeare.
Really? I didn't know that either. Gosh.
I mean, I can't remember what play it was. I think it was one of the historic plays.
Yeah, I probably haven't read that one. Yeah.
You just keep coming across as like, oh my God, that's a Shakespeare thing. That's a Shakespeare thing. So the influence on how we actually use language today is still there. And then there's just the dramatic effect, the way he talks about the characters. And the very deep psychological situation and difficulties, like people like Hamlet or King Lear, maybe more expressed in the tragic plays. Yeah. But that's very, very entertaining, and it's very, very clever. I think when you think of tasawwuf in Islam, and you think of the study of the human self, and how can a person become a better version of themselves, if you look at life through that perspective, I think you come to appreciate an author like Shakespeare, who has a very, very strong, insightful analysis of what we would call in Islam as the human self.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait anymore. We've got to dive in, and we've got to sample some Shakespeare. And if I may start, I'm going to just read a short passage from this play by William Shakespeare called The Merchant of Venice. And this is the Penguin Classics edition. Now, I'm going to just read one short speech from someone called Portia, and this is in the fourth act of the play. And what it is, I think, is a beautiful spiritual summary of an Islamic understanding of God and his mercy. And we find this in a Shakespeare play. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that, by the way, that Shakespeare was a Muslim, but it just so happens that his understanding of God and God's mercy, I think, is very similar to the Quran's understanding of what the Quran teaches about God's mercy. Now, I won't go into the whole story, but it's a fascinating story. If you're not familiar with it, you can see YouTube versions of films of it, many versions online. But this is about the quality of mercy, God's mercy towards us. And this is how Shakespeare expresses it. Now, I'm not an actor or anything, so forgive me for my poor rendition, but I just really want people, if you're not familiar with it, to have a little sample of what Shakespeare wrote. So he says, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives, and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes a throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this. In the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoken thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which if thou follow this strict court of Venice, must needs give sentence against the merchant there." End quote. I mean, I could translate this into everyday 21st century English. I'm not going to do that, but it really is powerful stuff. Powerful spiritual truth, which we can remind us of the character of God and God's mercy, and how if we as imperfect creatures were to be judged by the strict standards of justice, we would not see salvation, as Shakespeare put it. We need mercy. Beautiful stuff.
I would also add that, I mean, that one of the things that's happening in the background, you know, in that play, Shylock is very material. He's looking literally for a pound of flesh.
Literally, yes.
Literally, that's, you know, and that expression, by the way, speaking of expressions, like that's a Shakespearean expression.
That's no metaphor. He actually wants the pound of flesh of another person.
Portia is taking him to the metaphysical realm to talk about the importance of mercy and how it comes down like rain. It's attribute of God. It's twice blessed, etc. Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, it's a play, right? And these plays are meant to be performed and meant for us to watch. But when you think about that distinction, that here is the protagonist who's looking for something very material and grotesque, which is to take a pound of somebody's flesh in their back, and then here is somebody that's advocating for this, you know, metaphysical quality of mercy. So it's just very beautiful. I mean, just to think about somebody in the 16th century that's talking like this in the English language, I think it's a very striking thing.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have a passage you want to show?
I have a couple. This is the New York limited edition club, which was very hard for me to procure. It's from 1939.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
There's a story behind why I wanted this one. But this is A Midsummer's Night's Dream. Yeah. And in the opening of Act 5, he talks a little bit about, you know, the authors and poets and whatnot. And then he says, "The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So, this is a part of a verse that's often invoked by poets and authors, and about literally the magic of writing and taking these concepts, and the poet or the creator, maybe one can say, and grabbing that idea and then using the pen to give life to it. I think it's a very beautiful thing. I think we all try to do that. If we consider ourselves creatives in whatever we do, it's trying to give physical manifestation to an idea that we feel very strongly about. I think that's a very moving passage.
It is. Gosh. The passage I want to share next is from one of his most famous and celebrated plays, and that, of course, is Hamlet. Don't worry, I'm not going to inflict any more readings from myself on anyone. The quality of mercy is not strained here. I'm showing some mercy, but I do want to share, however, an extract from a very short video.
Well, just for the sake of me and anyone listening, what can you give us the act and scene of the?
Yes. Yeah, let me, absolutely. So this is from, it doesn't actually say. It's the famous to be.
Oh, I found it. It's Act 3, Scene 1.
Apologies, I should have done that. So so let me just share that, because I didn't do it correctly. Yeah, this is one of the great performances of Shakespeare's play by Kenneth Branagh. He plays Hamlet. He also directed it as well. And this is the famous scene where Hamlet, played by Kenneth Branagh, gives a great soliloquy, this kind of solo speech, which is very moving. And I just wanted to share this with you. Well. Extraordinary.
I mean, there's just so much there. It's just, I mean, you could spend quite a bit of time just unpacking the meaning of that. Actually, I had to memorize that when I was in high school, and I performed that several times. Of course, I forgot a lot of it from memory, but I remember the emotions that our teacher and I used to act as well. So our director would try to help us, walk us through trying to internalize that emotion and then bringing it out in the performance. It's a very moving soliloquy. I mean, obviously, probably his most famous, and in it, many of the expressions, slings and arrows. There's
outrageous fortune and the undiscovered country. This is life after death. Man has. I mean, in a way, we haven't been there. Those of us who are alive in this world is undiscovered for us. But of course, if for Muslims and for others who still have authentic revelation, we know that there is life after death, and we do have some understanding of what happens. But we will encounter, we will be accountable, we will be accounted, and so it's undiscovered in terms of a personal journey, but we do have a map, and the map comes from the Quran.
Sure.
And it's extraordinary. And here he's saying, my interpretation is, we suffer in life the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, whether it be sickness or mischance or whatever. And surely it'd be better just to end it all, really. Why continue? But for the fear of what will come afterwards, the fear of the undiscovered country. And this is a healthy fear, of course. We're not supposed to throw our lives away like that. But it is very, very moving. And of course, the whole thing about the end there and about action. Of course, Hamlet is famously indecisive and can't quite get his act together, really. And so he's puzzling over what he should do and what he shouldn't do. And it's very, very human, very, very existential, and timeless, perennial, in both its message and in the sheer power of Shakespeare's ability to communicate that in an extraordinary soliloquy.
Indeed.
Do you have another passage you want to share before my next one?
There's this passage from Romeo and Juliet that invokes, high school heartbreak and whatnot. Let me see if I can find. I thought I had it. I pulled it out last night for you. But this is part of when Romeo first sees Juliet.
All right.
he says at the end, "The measure done, I'll watch her place of stand, and touching hers make blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love till now forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night."
It's really, yeah.
So that's one of the things from high school. I remembered the impact of these, this teenager who just literally love at first glance, and that intense experience. Of course, a very tragic story, but we forget that they were very young. Whenever people are upset about the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anhu marrying the Prophet sallallahu very young, I'm always thinking, well, if you actually knew how old Romeo and Juliet were, I think she was 15 or 14 or something like that in the play. I mean, she says it in the beginning of the play how old she is. It's all relative. But that line about not experiencing love until he saw this, his object of love, I think it was a very, very impactful line for me that I remember.
Yeah, I remember watching Leonardo DiCaprio's. He played Romeo in his version of that, and very, very moved by that. And the music was stunning as well. It was almost operatic, and there was pop music, and it was very dramatic.
Yeah. I think actually that came out while I was in high school, if I'm not mistaken, or around that time. So I remember we read the play and we saw the movie. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was based in California, and in California you saw Venice Beach, whatever. It was very contemporary. I thought some of the performances were really not good at all. Well, one or two of them, but Caprio's was great, and the other major actors were very good, I thought. And it was great.
I'm not into the modern interpretation. I think I remember when we used to have to read Shakespeare when we were in school. There was always a tendency to try to read, as an American, to try to read it with a British accent. And I remember our teacher would be like, actually, that's not how Shakespeare sounded. Just read it in normal English. And that, for me, was a big epiphany. Oh, okay, it's not like this Elizabethan, English. That's not how he sounded.
Yeah.
And I think that to do the performance of it justice, which is another topic altogether, I think you really need to act the way it was meant to act by him, by the playwright himself, and using the tools that he had at this time. But anyway, that's just a personal preference.
No, I completely agree. Absolutely. The next one, I want to show another short clip from the famous play about Julius Caesar, called Julius Caesar. As a very short clip, and there's an amazing actor called Damian Lewis. And just get this up on the screen. Here we are. This is Act 3, Scene 2. This is just after Julius Caesar has died, been killed, of course, by Brutus and others. And Damian Lewis, as Antony, Mark Antony in the play, is addressing the crowds just after Julius Caesar dies. Friends, Romans, countrymen, very famous soliloquy. And it's not just, Damien does more than just act here. He completely inhabits the role. He is Antony, actually, in a way I've very rarely seen before. An extraordinary performance, as you will see for yourself, inshallah. So, and I just share this with you for the sheer pleasure of Shakespeare. This hasn't got a particularly spiritual message or anything like that. It's just an extraordinary play performed by an extraordinary English actor. So here we go.
It's very interesting. Sometimes when we think of composition, writing, we're thinking in a very linear way. But see, in the very beginning, he says, here under leave of Brutus and the rest. And then he has like an aside, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men. And then he comes back, come, I to speak in Caesar's funeral. That's really how we speak in real life. That's how we speak.
Yeah.
I have a thought, and then I said, by the way, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I come back, and then punctuating in this sort of tongue-in-cheek way, and Brutus is an honorable man, and he keeps
repeating that. Brutus is an honorable man. Each time he starts off being apparently very sincere. No, he's an honorable man. But each rendition of Brutus was an honorable man. You can see the color change, the intention change.
So he's communicating that feeling.
Yes.
And we feel it. And that's what I think good language is about. It's about feeling, feeling it. And that I have never seen that before, by the way. That's a phenomenal rendition.
I've seen the one by Marlon Brando, which is phenomenal, very different, but always is on YouTube. Marlon Brando, Julius Caesar, you can watch it now. and there are others as well. Marlon Brando was surprisingly good. I say surprising because I didn't associate him as a Shakespeare actor, but he was very, very good as a Shakespeare actor as well.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, and there are others that are also very good. So I was very moved by that, particularly by the acting. Actually, very struck. He was totally authentic. I actually believed he was Antony. He could.
And then, my soul is in the grave with just hold. Let me compose myself again.
Yeah,
It's very real. I mean, that's how
he's so churned up. He just, please let me just collect myself. And he thought, yeah, I really believe you. You need time, dude.
Yeah.
The thing is, if I'd read that on the page, I wouldn't have had that kind of emotional impact on me. But seeing it come to life with that actor made all the difference for me, and made it absolutely vivid and real.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say, Martin Lings, he talks a lot about that, about the importance of the acting of the play, and he even mentioned, I think this was in an interview I saw, which is also available on YouTube, that I think it was maybe Othello, or he saw one of the tragic plays, his first time ever seeing a Shakespeare performance. And even though the play is this great tragedy, he was in this state of euphoria for several days afterwards.
Because of
and I actually had a very similar experience when I acted, I think it was Twelfth Night in high school.
Right.
So, it's the play, it's just a standard, Shakespeare play, but also feeling this great deal of happiness afterwards. And there's something about, it's not just reading it, but it's the performance, or at least reading it out loud and trying to act as you're reading it, but seeing the performance of the play, because these plays are meant to be performed. Yeah. It really is transformative, I have to say.
It's interesting you mentioned Martin Lings. Martin Lings is called another Englishman who became a Muslim, and he actually taught Shakespeare, I think, in Egypt for a time as a university academic. So he knew what he was talking about, and he wrote a couple of books. This is the one I've got here by him: Shakespeare's Window into the Soul, the mystical wisdom of in Shakespeare's characters. And there's also that one of The Secret of Shakespeare's Greatest Plays Seen in the Light of Sacred Art. And they both got introductions by someone who was then the Prince of Wales, who's now the King of England, no less, Charles III.
Not a bad endorsement.
Not a bad endorsement for my book. But there's a chapter there on Othello. In fact, most of his, the big Hamlet, the big plays, and Martin Lings, I say, he's no longer with us, but he was a celebrated Muslim. Now, I must make a plug for his Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace. For me, his book on the Prophet's life is a masterpiece of English literature, a great biography. I mean, the only reason it's not much more widely appreciated in the literary world is its subject, i.e. the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace. It's the most marvelous book. It's not always easy to read, but you can see how Martin Lings was influenced by great literature, by Shakespeare, in the way he articulates this extraordinary life of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace. So I really recommend that as well. Okay, well, I'm going to inflict on you, I do apologize. Shakespeare wrote lots of sonnets, by the way. You know this, Tarek.
I have my little pocket.
Yes,
that's right.
Pocket book of Shakespeare's. How delightful. I've got the slightly more chunky, the Oxford Book of English Verse by Briggs, who's actually an Englishman teaching at Boston University. And I mean, all of his sonnets are worth reading, but probably one of his most famous is sonnet number 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And I just can't resist reading it. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, though winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Some time too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often in his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So, so it's quite an extraordinary conceit, really. So this person's beauty, will survive eternally. Why? Because Shakespeare's writing about it. These eternal lines basically preserve the memory of the beauty of someone who lived in the 15th or 16th centuries. So this poem immortalizes this very temporary beauty of this human being, comparing it to a summer's day, and how much more beautiful is this person compared to that. But even then, it is immortalized in the sonnet.
This sonnet specifically is often used to teach the importance of that poetic meter, the iambic pentameter.
Yeah.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
Yes.
And that's when you get that, then you start to think about how it sounds, how the English of Shakespeare sounds, and how it's just so rhythmic, and it's the word choice, but also the rhythm of it, I think, that causes the work to last and for us to be moved by it still.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your turn, I think, if you have anything to share.
Well, I like Sonnet 30.
Oh, okay.
Because the translator, I can't remember his name right now, but the translator who translated Marcel Proust from French to English.
There are lots of translators, though. I'm not sure which one would that be.
He translated it as Remembrance of Things Past.
Oh, yes. Oh, right. Right.
Sonnet 30.
That's from, yes, I see what you mean. Yes.
Rather than In Search of Lost Time, which is probably more appropriate to the original French. He says, when to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye unused to flow for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh love's long silence cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Then can I grieve at grievances foregone, and heavily from woe to woe, till over the sad account of fore bemoaned moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before. But if the whole I think on thee, dear friend, and losses are restored and sorrows end.
Mm-hmm. Very touching. And these are great little poems to meditate on. I used to read them during my lunch hour at work, and just to just help to punctuate the day with something profound and something beautiful like that. And another reason to read Shakespeare is it helps to increase one's vocabulary, one's ability to articulate clearly one's views or one's understanding of life. And it helps to upgrade oneself in terms of one's ability to use language, and that is really amazing. I just incredibly grateful for that.
So there's an American novelist and historian. His name is Shelby Foote, and Shelby Foote is famous for writing this very massive 3-volume Civil War narrative. So he took the American Civil War and he wrote this. It's like 3,000 pages plus, and he wrote it as if it was a novel. And when you're a freshman or sophomore in an American high school, you will study American history, and part of what you study is the American Civil War. So when I was in high school, there is a documentary by Ken Burns called The Civil War, in which Shelby Foote features frequently. So as a very young man, learning about America and American Civil War, I was exposed to Shelby Foote. And he has this Southern drawl. He's very articulate, and he approaches it the way a novelist approaches it. But as I got older and I read Shelby Foote's novels, there were two things that I benefited the most from him. One was the importance of Marcel Proust, who I just mentioned. Yeah. So I actually read, in English, of course, I read the entire novel, Remembrance of Things Past, which was very another long story for another time.
Yeah.
And I reconnected with the importance of Shakespeare. So I really owe my renewed appreciation from Shakespeare from Shelby Foote, who said, Shakespeare is the grand master teacher, and a writer can always learn something from Shakespeare. So it's just one of those things where you keep going back, especially the major plays, the plays that are famous, that like the ones that you've been sharing with us and we kind of read from a little bit. There's always something you can learn by the turn of phrase, by how the characters are, the sketch of the character, the inner tensions that the nefs of those characters are going through, how he's able to capture some of these very complicated, like you mentioned, the passage of mercy in the play of Merchant of Venice, and how he's able to really in just short lines capture this great concept of God's mercy and how we should be merciful to one another. And I think there's always something, as you said, there's always something to learn. And that's why I think Shakespeare was important, is important, and will continue to be important, at least for the English-speaking world.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if I may change tack slightly to a non-Shakespeare poet, because you mentioned America, which is entirely appropriate, of course, as you are in America. But one of your and our, because he's Anglo-American poets,
Sure.
T.S. Eliot, who was born, according to the back cover here, born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1888. He settled in England in 1915 and published his first book of poems in 1917. He received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948. And this is one of the reasons why he got the Nobel Prize in Literature, is the 4 quartets. And he wrote other things called like The Wasteland, and other works as well, and some musicals like Cats. Cats is actually by T.S. Eliot, believe it or not. But this is my favorite poem by him. I never quite warmed to The Wasteland, which is, I think, his magnum opus. Maybe this is. Anyway, I tend to think The Wasteland is a great work. But just the opening paragraph to the 4 quartets is a profound meditation on the nature of time. It's a very spiritual work. He talks about God and so on. He writes as a Christian, though, but very profound. And I'm just going to read, if I may, the opening paragraph, which is very famous and for me very moving and difficult as well. It's not meant. He was a modernist. That's what he called himself. He was a modernist poet. So there was an element of intentional difficulty in what he wrote. Anyway, here goes. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. And I'm not going to comment too much on this, but it is a profound meditation on the nature of the past and the future and the present and of the dunya, if you like, of this world. And whenever I go back to this poem, which sometimes I do carry around like you do in my pocket, I always discover new things. I say he won the Nobel Prize for Literature for this work. And it's very, very powerful.
Well, the issue of time. I mean, there's a very important hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "La tusubbu ad-dahra fa inna ad-dahra huwa Allah." Do not curse time, for time is God. And obviously, God is not time, and that's not what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, but he is the owner of time and the creator of time. And from the perspective of God, there is no time. There is no past, present, and future. From a theological point of view, it's just one creative moment. We are the ones that experience time. So there is an echo of that hadith in the lines that you read. And that's another thing I think about great literature, especially great literature written by non-Muslims, who are seeking to try to articulate high meanings, metaphysical meanings through their literary work. As a believer, I almost find it like a commentary on these different principles, axiomatic principles that we have, like the hadith that I just mentioned about time, or hadith about mercy or something like that. And I think it's very important. And I think the reason why that literature is considered part of the canon and or the English canon or the Western canon is that they're getting at something really real. For us, we find the real in the primary text, the Quran and the hadith literature. But there's equally valid commentaries on that. And I think that's why, as a believer, I also appreciate, and I'm sure you do too, just good literature. It's just very, very, yeah, that's a great way of saying it. Like when I read Proust,
Mm.
I mean, even though Proust's personal biography is the most antithetical person to a practicing Muslim, but when you read the novel,
True.
and you talk about the redeeming value of art and how to recall from your subconscious, through art, a deep memory. And I mean, it's very, very profound, very metaphysical. I was very moved. I mean, I was sometimes to the point of tears in some of the passages that I read. I think that's very powerful and very important to reflect on as a believer.
Yeah, gosh, no, I'm glad you're mentioning Marcel Proust. I never finished La Recherche du Temps Perdu. Remember times past. It's a long book, but I must go back to it one day, inshallah, and renew my acquaintance with him. I just wanted to share one last poem, really. Again, it's completely random in a way. There's a famous 19th century English poet called Gerald Manley Hopkins. And he was a Jesuit priest, actually, in a church. In fact, he taught at a church not far from here in London, in Mayfair. And he was a profoundly spiritual writer, but a very creative one. He introduced a very new style of poetry, which I won't go into. But I just want to share with you one poem which he wrote about giving glory to God through the creation, and you'll get a sense, hopefully, of how unique and
what's the name of the poem?
It's called, sorry, I should have said, Pied Beauty, Pied Beauty, Pied, Pied Beauty. There's only two short paragraphs, stanzas as they're called, You get a sense of the very unique language that he developed in his poetic style, and which is can be quite difficult at first to get one's head around, but there is a beauty to it as well. But this is a hymn of praise to God by looking at the color of things and the way things appear to him, whether they be birds' wings or whatever. And I'll just read it and do my best, because it's not easy to articulate. Actually, it's actually quite a difficult poem. But anyway, I'll stop talking now. So he wrote this, Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of copple colour as a brined cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pierced, fold, fallow and plough, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, adazzle, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. And that's nice. At the end is just like a psalm that you get psalms that use just, this is very much like a psalm in the Bible, actually. But the way he uses language there, I mean, he's delighting in the sound of language, its meaning, in very, very unique ways. He developed this style of poetry all himself, and a lot of his poetry, the world, another one, God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. I won't read all of it. That's a poem called God's Grandeur, which you easily find online. Again, these are mouthfuls. There's a banquet of words. One has to kind of enjoy them and just go with it and get the sense of the sound as well as the meaning and the feel of the words. And there's a story, I think it's true, that he gave he gave a sermon once in Farm Street Church, which is in Mayfair, not far from here. And he compared the seven sacraments of the church. He was a Roman Catholic priest, a Jesuit priest. He compared the seven sacraments of the church to a cow's udders. Okay, so he was there. Now he was preaching to very high society Victorian ladies and gentlemen, and he was comparing the seven sacraments to a cow's udders in his inimicable style. It caused outrage and scandal, but of course it was perhaps maybe not appropriate. But he deployed his extraordinary genius for language and and ended up scandalizing the church. But apparently that actually happened in the 1870s or something.
Tolstoy, he in his book What is Art, he, in seeking to define art, he talks about how art is really the way of communicating emotion from one person to another. So from that point of view, all artists are the same. It doesn't matter if it's an artist of the performing arts or traditional arts, or in this case poetry or the written arts, but it's all about communicating feeling. And in my journey to reconnect with Shakespeare and literature, Western literature, let's say, not just English, but Western literature, is seeing it from that lens. I just mentioned, there are literally, I'm not embarrassed to say, there are things that are just so moving. You're like, what did I just, oh my God. Sometimes I just have to put the book down, and I don't know, something overcomes you in how that concept was phrased, something that maybe you felt, and in your heart, in your soul is true, but you've never had the words to articulate it.
I had that, by the way, to interrupt. I had exactly that sensation while I was reading what is often seen as the greatest novel in the English language, a novel by George Eliot, the English writer.
Middlemarch?
Middlemarch, of course. George Eliot wasn't a guy, but a dude.
I know.
I know you know, but she was called Mary Ann Evans. She used a man's name. She published either 1840s, 1850s, or whatever. She wanted obviously to be accepted without having the femaleness about her being a problem in Victorian England. Anyway, in this astonishing book, Middlemarch, which I've read a couple of times now, I remember the first time I read it, I was about halfway through, and I had to put the book down. I had to stop reading it because I experienced overload, sensory, intellectual, emotional overload. And it was like I had gorged myself on a banquet, and I thought, I'm going to have to put this book down for the moment and just walk away from the book, because it was so. She was a genius of psychological insight in her novels, understanding the deep roots of human motivations, how people behave towards each other, their motivations, their character, how their circumstances impact on their lives, and so on. But she does it in such a fantastically profound way in a novel. So it's a work of fiction that it just overwhelmed me, and I had to step away. And then only days or weeks later could I go back and begin the journey again. There was also a negative experience, but she was so powerful in her rhetoric and her psychological insight into human nature and so on, that I've never encountered anything like it before, and I can see why people value her so greatly.
So unfortunately, embarrassingly, I have her collected works, and I haven't gotten around to reading it, simply because this is a very small, unimportant detail. But the collected works I have Middlemarch spread over 2 volumes, and it always frustrates me. I want to read the novel, but I don't want to carry 2 books around with me. So I'll get around to it. But
yeah.
So the artist communicating emotion, etc., creating a sensation that maybe wasn't articulated before. And then that got me thinking about, and this is going to sound a little bit wacky, but just give me a moment to explain myself. It got me thinking about the concept of the mujtahid in Islam, that the mujtahid is a person who has risen to the point that they can understand directly the primary sources and derive and extract rulings and meanings for them to guide the community. Maybe those rulings and meanings were not articulated before. And in that respect, I see the artist as the mujtahid. There's a huge overlap between the two. And that gave me a completely different understanding of somebody like Shakespeare. Of course, I'm not saying that these people are spiritually, because the mujtahid is also a spiritual rank within the Islamic context. I understand that there's differences, but the idea of communicating the sensation of Islam, let's say, the meaning and the feeling of the primary revelation, versus the secular artist who's trying to communicate human feelings in a way that no one has done before, there's a great overlap. And I found that comparison to be much more rich than what a normal practicing Muslim does, to look at a Christian theologian or a Jewish theologian or a Hindu philosopher or something like that, which is sort of, you just assume that you're comparing apples to apples. But I think that there's a big difference. I think we should also include these artists, because there are some unbelievable, as you've mentioned, insights that they have that are very, very fascinating. So that's where kind of my journey through Shakespeare kind of led me to, that's one of the conclusions I came to.
Absolutely. I mean, I won't inflict any more readings on you, so I'm going to sort of leave it there. But I do. If someone's a complete novice to Shakespeare, and this is not meant as an insult, Shakespeare for Dummies is actually very good, and it's recommended by Dame Judi Dench, who's a famous Shakespearean actor here in England. Shakespeare for Dummies is exquisite, she says. So this is very accessible. It goes through the plays and his context and the poems and how to, actually suggesting you watch all of the plays. Actually, you can tick them off one by one. So
to that point, as an American, I am not familiar with some of the English meaning Britain's history. I mean, there are some things I know, but not nearly enough. So Shakespeare's historical plays, the earlier plays, Richard III, Henry VIII, etc. I had to read the Wikipedia page, especially the synopsis, before I read the play, because I don't know who Bolingbroke is. I don't know who these people. They did that word, or Warwick, or the Duke of this or that. Those, as an American, those things really don't mean anything to me. I understand.
Not only Americans today, people living today in England have most, not all, but mostly lost contact, I would suggest, with their history. They wouldn't have that kind of automatic, if you talk about Warwick, or they wouldn't know what that meant in a sense that they have. They're like Americans now, and this is one of the. I don't mean that what I mean is that modernity or post-modernity has cut us off from our past in many ways, and we no longer rehearse our stories from the past so much. And this is a common lot of people in the West now, actually.
So there's no problem with reading something like Shakespeare for Dummies, or when I was growing up, there were the Cliff Notes. I can't remember what publishing house, but there's a publishing house that publishes the Shakespeare such that in one page is the original English, and then in the corresponding page is the modern English of that. Those type of tools are fine because they're like a bridge that help you get to access it. But once you get over that bridge and you get to the Shakespeare, it's really like something else. I mean, it's really transformative. And that's why Shakespeare is going to be somebody, hopefully, inshallah, that people will go back to and read, especially the key, 7, 8 plays will read throughout their lives several times, not just once.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, my favorites are the tragedies. Okay. Fairly gloomy thing to say, but Hamlet and King Lear.
Well, that's where he brings out the inner demons, and the tension that we all have within us, and that's why it's important. But there are some funny comedies as well,
I disagree. I was disappointed. I was As You Like It. I saw that once, and I thought the audience was laughing around me. I thought, I see the joke, but it's just not that funny. I'm sorry. And I'm sure they must have heard this before. I mean, it's not like no one's heard these jokes before. And they were kind of okay. And maybe they were funny in the 16th century or whatever, but I didn't find them very funny, actually. And a lot of it's based on puns and
well, I mean, it's not going to be like Monty Python or something like that.
You see, we're post Monty Python generation, so we expect some pretty sophisticated silliness.
But I mean, compared to like Sophocles and Oedipus and these huge tragic, ancient Greek tragic figures, and then Shakespeare's own tragic figures, those plays are comedies. I mean, from that point of view. But I mean, they're not. I'm going to fall off my seat, laughing, crying comedies.
I've never laughed particularly at a Shakespeare joke at all. I never found them funny. No, I think Monty Python has basically corrupted everything for me.
No, there's these lines about, the first thing we got to do is kill all the lawyers. I think that's from Henry VIII.
See, when I hear that, I think that's a statement of fact. It's supposed to be funny.
There's this one line, I think, is it from King Lear, where I think like somebody wants to kiss the king's hand, and he's like, "Wait a second, let me rub off the mortality," or something like that. I mean, no, there are these very poignant.
There's a lot of wit in here. This is true.
Wit. I think that's the proper word.
Wit. I was thinking of jokes, but no, you're right. The wit is there all over the place. No, absolutely. And he's the pun master supremo. I mean, can this guy do puns? And they're kind of supposedly out of fashion, but he does them very well. And
so one of the things we talked about offline, I don't know if you wanted to talk about it now or not, was the idea of a canon.
Oh yes.
I mean, I guess you were supposed to introduce the concept, but anyway, what we talked about, is Shakespeare part of the canon? What is a canon? Is the canon important? Of course, I mean, I'm not a literary expert, so I don't want to act like, but if you don't mind, maybe we can
Please, no, I think it's good. Yeah, I mean, I first read in depth about the idea of a Western canon in Harold Bloom's great book on the canon of literature, and he was a professor of literature. I forget if it was Harvard or Yale. One of those. Yale. A very famous literary critic in his day. I think he's now passed away, but some years ago. But he was a doughty defender of the canon as it began in the 1980s, I think, to come under sustained criticism in the academic world, because it was cast as basically books by dead white men, basically. And this is true. Most of them are dead white men, apart from George Eliot, obviously, who was actually a woman. And it came under attack, and people wanted to open up the canon or abolish the canon and listen to minority voices and minority works, and there was some justification in that, arguably. And now, of course, it's queer poetry and all sorts of things are happening now. But I still think, maybe it's because I'm a white male, though, but there is a place for the Western canon as Harold Bloom defended it famously. Precisely because it does actually contain. So what is a canon? Well, my understanding is, please tell me your view as well, is that these are works that have stood the test of time over many, many generations, centuries even. So someone like Chaucer from the 1300s in London in the UK, his Canterbury Tales. With the Wife of Bath and the Pardoner. These are riotously funny. These are funny and
hilarious. They're hilarious.
Yeah, they really are funny, and often in ways which we're not supposed to find funny as well. But and for me, it's like going into a time machine. What one is through one's imagination. What one is entering into the medieval London. It really is, and this pilgrimage from Southwark to Canterbury or somewhere, and it's great fun. It's great fun. Now, this is difficult English, by the way. You do need notes because his English is even older than Shakespeare's, of course. But he has stood the test of time. It's great literature, and so he is part of this canon, this list of books which are seen as the great works of Western literature. And it's not just English works. So Dante's in there, Divine Comedy, of course, and other non-English works as well. So I still think it's their place, but I do think there should be other canons. This is why, I think not just one canon. There should be, the canon must open up to other voices and other literature for sure. But I don't like it just being, the idea of having queer poetry is now part of excuse me, that this is now turned into identity politics, which has nothing to do with literature at all. This is just some other agenda, which I don't like. But, having so-called minority voices, women's voice, why not?
Well, first of all, I'm not a fan of of Bloom or critics. I think that's like fake art, but that's a separate issue altogether. But I am a believer in the canon simply because a canon, and we have our own canon in Islam as well. The canon is simply the accepted works that each generation accepts as authoritative, important, representative of core values. So in the West, obviously the canon is going to be dead white men because that's largely the predominant demographic of Western Europe. Not entirely, but that's just the case. It's like somebody coming to me and saying, well, I don't accept Bukhari and Muslim to be part of the Hadith canon. I was like, well, that's impossible because every generation of Islam since those books were compiled till now, we can fill a whole house, a whole library just of books commenting on those. So obviously we've accepted them. That doesn't mean those are the only Hadith books. There are other Hadith books. There are Shia Hadith books, but those books are not part of the Sunni canon, for example. So that's really all it means. The fact that we're, all these years later, still talking about Shakespeare, still recognizing these phrases, still laughing and crying about some of these passages and these poems and the sonnets means that he continues to be relevant. That's really all the canon means. It doesn't mean that there are other voices that are not important. It just means that those voices are not as impactful and as authoritative in this sort of field that we're talking about, which is literature or Western literature. Mm-hmm. The other thing is the attack on the canon is an attack on authority, and that's like a postmodern problem. And there are many Muslims that want to attack the canon of the hadith or the canon of this or the madhahib of fiqh or something like that because they don't like this idea of authority. There is authority. There's intellectual authority, there's linguistic authority, there's philosophical authority, there's spiritual authority. It's just a part of life. Allah Ta'ala created the world in this way. Exactly. So to your point, there can be other canons or there can be auxiliary things that we also study. But you can't tell me that Beowulf is not important or that Chaucer is not important. They're very important. You can't tell me that Homer is not important. I mean, they used to recite Homer the way we recite the Quran. That was for them like something that means it was an important part of the ancient European tradition or the Greek tradition more specifically, and then therefore comes to impact the fact that we still have translations of Homer today, of the Iliad and we still have translations of those works coming out till today, even though they've already been translated. So I think that that's just a natural product of the human experience, is to have these collected things that we agree, each generation agrees is authoritative, impactful, representative. That's really it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Although I disagree with your disparagement of Harold Bloom, but we're not going to fight about that.
That's fine. That's fine.
No, but on this notion of canon, that there are works that are kind of half in our literary canon and half out. Thinking of Plato, all his dialogues, particularly Plato's Republic, for example, which is a work of art, is a work of literature, as well as an absolutely foundational philosophical text in the Western tradition. So it's part of the canon. Bloom has it in his canon. Many of Plato's dialogues, or all his books, are in dialogue form. Conversations between Socrates, usually, and some other guys. I like that, and they are masterpieces. And so I think the reason they endure, Plato particularly, is that he is so remarkable as a philosopher and as a stylist and as a communicator that he constantly amazes us and teaches us, even though he wrote 2,500 years ago. It's 500 BC that he was writing in ancient Greece, in Athens. Many people, I'm halfway through my second reading of the Republic again now, constantly impressed with his insights and his wisdom and his capacity to provoke as well. And because he's not politically correct and woke, and again, this time machine kind of idea that I have, one is going back to an ancient world. And sometimes you come up against some very strange assumptions about the universe, which we certainly don't have today. I mean, things about nature or biology, which are wrong. But just to remind one that, this guy really is living in a different world thousands of years ago. And that's refreshing because it helps me to escape the prison of my mental modernity. We live in this postmodern world with all its kind of wall-to-wall assumptions, and if I can escape from that through literature, it's very freeing, and it helps me to relativize my current opinions. I don't mean it in terms of creed, by the way. I'm talking about assumptions about the world around us. What's normal. It is a cultural product, and it's through literature one can learn how historically contingent and relative one's own cultural assumptions are. In other words, we are not universal beings. We are particular, we're end product of a particular cultural process. And literature is a way of escaping and entering into different universes of experience, of culture and meaning, in usually very ennobling ways, in very enriching ways.
I mean, when I was commenting on canon, I was thinking only of literature, but you brought up Plato and Aristotle. I mean, if you're talking about Western thought, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there'll be even Islamic sources that will go as far as to say that, Plato was a prophet and received revelation and whatnot. And specifically, Plato and Aristotle are massive for our purposes.
Yeah,
they were adopted, commented on by Muslim philosophers and theologians alike. And we continue to talk about Aristotle and Plato in Islamic thought in different Islamic subjects. So talk about the canon. I mean, that's like world canon, that's very, very important. You can't tell me that some of those other, ancient Greek philosophers were as important or authoritative as Plato and Aristotle, or Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, simply because of how widespread those teachings then became. And I think that that's what the canon really means. It's not about, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. It just means, people seem to gravitate to what this person is writing, as you said, continues to be relevant, continues to give meaning, continues to cause us to think and to comment. Even if we start to disagree with this or that, but we're still dealing and wrestling with their work, that means that that's part of the canon. Therefore, it's very important. Whereas there might be some other obscure ancient Greek philosopher that we're just not as concerned with, even though they might have said something very brilliant. It doesn't mean we won't read them and we won't revive their works, but they're not going to be as impactful as, for example, the writings of Plato or Aristotle.
Yeah. I mean, the impact of Aristotle is found through Thomism, Thomas Aquinas, who Christianized Aristotle. That's having impact today through what's called virtue ethics. People like Alistair MacIntyre, the British philosopher who's now been in the States for a long time, teaching at Princeton, I think it is. So his work after Virtue is a very influential text on moral philosophy today. This is directly Aristotelian. Thinking of Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher, allegedly Putin's brain, or he's not, but he's a very eminent Russian philosopher. He's written a book on Platonism. I mean, he's a Platonist. I mean, he identifies with Plato. And to give just two examples of quite influential intellectual thinkers from Russia and the United States, drawing directly and explicitly from Plato and Aristotle. And of course, Socrates didn't really write anything, but he's a character in these domains. So the influence is still there, and it's humming away in the background. And if we're to have a deeper understanding of why the West is the West, how it thinks, why it thinks the way it does, we need to go deep into our philosophy and our tradition by reading these works, because they still do apply. And I doubtless there are many Ivy League students in the States who still read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or whatever, or even Machiavelli's The Prince.
Like first week of intro philosophy, semester 1, and then after that you're off to reading about queer theory and Hobbes and the Leviathan and those type of things.
Well,
you have to read.
Hobbes is pretty awful if you he's a materialist.
Well, as our mutual friend, His Royal Highness Prince Ghazi always likes to say, well, he's the expert on this subject, not me. It's Plato, Aristotle, and that's it. You don't really need to know about anyone else after that, because they're just going to be different shades and grades away from those original teachings.
That wasn't original, because Prince Ghazi may have said that, but A.M. Whitehead, the British philosopher, said that all philosophy since Plato is merely a footnote to his thought. So, and I see what he means.
Well, that was very liberating for me, because I had to take a lot of philosophy throughout undergrad and graduate school, and I mean, Kant and Descartes, and I mean, just sometimes just spending an hour just trying to figure out what they're saying on a page, and just really, really struggling with that. And then realizing, okay, it is just a regurgitation in one way, shape, or form of what Plato and Aristotle said. So if you have the collected works of Plato and Aristotle, then you can just constantly go back to them from a thought point of view. But coming back to sort of Shakespeare, I think it's also important, for me at least, I want to help myself become more articulate, in how I speak or how I try to get my message across, because I'm always teaching or speaking or preaching or something like that. And I also found that this is beyond a specific language issue. So I used to think wrongly that if I had spent more time in English literature, I would lose my Arabic, or vice versa. And then I realized that it's not. They actually reinforce one another, because language is just language. I mean, there are different words and idioms, yes, but I mean, the concept of language for us, it goes back to some type of revelation. When God says وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, that God taught Adam the names of all things, there's a divine component to at least proto-language. So for me, I have found it tremendously useful in all aspects of my life, my intellectual life, and even in my personal life, just being able to think about how do I want to articulate what I'm feeling or what I'm trying to get across, whether it's to my children, my wife, my friends, my family, etc.
But although I completely agree with you, I think there are unique challenges today. I know it's a cliche for young people, for all of us, we all inhabit the same world, to actually extricate ourselves from TikTok, from Twitter, from YouTube. I mean, he's been slagging or criticizing YouTube. We're on YouTube. And to find time to read books. And I don't mean audio books on YouTube. I mean, actually get the physical book and just go off and read it. To take ourselves away from these technologies is actually quite difficult, but not just for young people, for all of us, because it's very seductive. And so I think perhaps for the first time in history, we are becoming illiterate in some ways, where we're losing contact with our past, the great classics of literature, and that means and that impoverishment, that's what it is quite serious. Actually, it's not just a culture. It really affects how we participate in society, how we speak, how we analyze what's going on around us. If we lose these incredible resources, which are books, the great books.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on something that's unfortunately, I agree 100%, and very, very sad and scary. The logic that we study in Islam is a kind of slimmed down version of like the introduction of Aristotelian logic. And Imam al-Ghazali says in the beginning of the Mustasfa, which is his book on Usul al-Fiqh, but like the first like 90, 100 pages is in logic. He's like, if anyone who doesn't know logic, you can't trust the way they think, because then they don't think logically. Well, I find a lot of people today don't think logically. And a lot of that is simply like the basic kind of idea, if A is B and B is C, then A is C, something as simple as that. Believe it or not, people, I don't know, maybe that's your opinion. Maybe I feel like it's D or something like that. And it's also all relative.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying it tongue in cheek, but that's a lot of what's happening. So what we're losing also is we're losing the combined and shared way of thinking. Because people are not reading. So it's not just that we're illiterate, but people are also losing their way to think. And that's why now people and states, governments are just completely incoherent. And I remember last year, I've mentioned this several times already, but last year, I think it was in December, there was a week when the United States was airdropping food and aid on Gaza. And that same week, they were being bombed by American munitions. I mean, what could be more incoherent than that? Are you at war with them, or are you trying to help them? And that for me was like the peak. Like that was an epiphany moment for me. That that's how incoherent, at least in the United States, my government has become. And then I start to see that throughout a lot of people. Now, if you try to mention that, people know, but you have to understand the fact that you can't even recognize the unbelievable incoherence of that means that you've lost the way to critically think about something. And all of that comes back to what you're saying, is that we're essentially an illiterate people now, because we're not reading these great works. We're not commenting on them together. Then there used to be a time where people would quote things from Shakespeare, or quote a poem from Eliot, and people would or quote sections of Homer or Chaucer. The truth will out. That comes from Chaucer. Lay on Macduff. That's from Hamlet. When you're about to go do something serious. So those are English expressions that we got. Now, I think if you said that, people wouldn't even know what that meant.
Yeah, I've had that in conversation, not with everyone, but with a lot of people. I deliberately, not dumb down, but I switch off certain things I would normally say, just spontaneously, because I start with humor as well. And humor is really important to everyone, but for English people as well. Obviously, we like to play with words and understatement and dry sarcasm.
Oh yeah, I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah, exactly. So I like to deploy references, but I think are very obvious from, say, Shakespeare or whatever. And often I have to shut myself down and say, don't do that, Paul, because I know what's going to go straight over people's head. So I treasure those times when I meet people like yourself and others, where I can just be myself and make a kind of a silly point, which is based on a reference to whatever, and you'll get it because we share that common language, that common patrimony from the past, from literature, and that's a rare privilege where I can just I can be myself now and just speak.
Well, that's also happening within our own community. I mean, the fact that Muslims now are arguing about what I think is the most insignificant and very minor points that have been settled for over 1,000 years. People are now online fighting about them. It's because they've lost that shared authority, that shared canon, and that accepted wisdom that we've inherited generation after generation. And that's a very scary sign. We've been dealing with it for a couple of 100 years now. It's been a problem. And now it's happening in the West as well, where, people are not reading. I mean, I was surprised. I'm still surprised that at many schools, kids don't have books anymore. It's like all digital assets. How can you go to school and not have a book? Even if you have to give the book back. I mean, many of the books we got in school, we gave them back at the end of the year or the semester. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't understand, like, how can you learn just on a screen? How can you read all of Shakespeare or just the major plays, at least just on the screen? Or how can you learn poetry just on the screen? That is beyond me. I mean, you have to get the book at some point. You have to have the physical book and look at it.
Yeah. It reminded me of a video I saw recently of your future president, Donald Trump. God help us all. It was being asked in an interview about his favorite book. And I thought, this is interesting. What's Donald Trump's favorite book? And he said, the Bible. And then the interviewer said, well, what's your favorite passage from the Bible? Did you see this interview?
I think I've heard of it. Yeah.
And he couldn't answer. I mean, he couldn't actually give a reference. He couldn't say like the Gospel of Matthew or the Book of Job or Genesis or the Book of Revelation or the amazing Epistle of Paul to the Romans or whatever. I mean, it's a library. The Bible's a library of books. It was his favorite book, he said, but he couldn't actually reference a single thing in it, which suggests to me that he might have been lying, and it wasn't actually his favorite book, but it was merely an icon, a symbol meant to Christian
politics.
I love the Bible, even though I don't know anything about it and I can't reference a single thing in it. I love the Bible. I mean, excuse me. It was so embarrassing. But the level of literacy that lack of literacy that betrays is astonishing. He couldn't even mention a platitude like, the Lord's Prayer or anything. He just said nothing.
Yeah. Well, I think that with the modern day democratic politics, it just devolved into everything is a soundbite. What's the right soundbite for this moment that's going to give me the most registered likes or votes, or have the best impact on the largest demographic? And again, that's an aspect of incoherence, because that's not how human interaction works. Then it's just you're not honest. You're just saying, this is the right answer here because there's like a vote attached to it or something like that. So that's a problem. I don't think it's just with him, by the way. I think he's just representative of a huge.
He's going to be your president soon. He can't actually reference a single thing from the book he loves most of all. You're thinking, does he ever read? I mean, goodness knows what. I mean, just in conclusion, I'm going to say something very controversial, and please shoot me down. It's very. I think we're bemoaning the fact that people don't know Shakespeare. They haven't read The Republic by Plato. They may not even know their Bible very well. There was a time certainly when a lot of people did read their Bibles, and we don't tend to read them anymore, really. Fair enough. But is it not the case, and this is a very unfashionable thing to say, that it was always the case that most people were never going to take an interest in Plato anyway? It was always going to be a minority interest to go and see a Shakespeare play. To have a proper understanding of the usul fiqh was always going to be a minority occupation of the scholars and their students. Well, let me just say, is not the problem here really the democratization of our world, the proletarianization of life, so that everyone now is supposed to know about Shakespeare and about Plato and about usul fiqh? But really, was it ever like that? And is it supposed to be like that? I mean, most of us are not interested in these things because, frankly, we're not interested in these things. It's just not part of our agenda in life. And there could be a reason for that. Maybe we're not, what's the un-PC way of putting it? We're not that intelligent. We're not going to sit down and read Plato's Republic, really, because you've got to be able to you know what I mean? So is there in fact not an intrinsic elitism in what we're talking about? Is it not elite? I don't mean 1%. I mean, it could be 40%, but there's still a minority. Do you see what I mean?
Think that you're right to say that intellectual pursuit, especially if something like Plato, the example you gave, Plato's Republic, it was always meant to be amongst an elite group of, or maybe that's the wrong word, but a small subset of scholars who were interested in that. That is true. And those type of books, I mean, not everyone's going to be able to read Al-Ghazali's Mustasfa and Usul al-Fiqh and understand. I get that. There's nothing wrong with saying that.
Right.
But something like Shakespeare, I mean, the whole idea of Shakespeare and being plays that are performed was precisely to connect with the masses. So there is an aspect of our scholarly tradition that can connect with the masses. And I think that that's also what we've lost, because we are losing this concept of a canon or authority. So yes, there's the problem of democratization, and then everyone has a phone and they can just create a social media account and comment on anything and everything. It doesn't mean that they actually have something important to say. That's true. I agree with that.
I think that's what I'm saying, yeah.
But in our tradition, in the Islamic tradition, for example, it was very common that in the mosque or the public spaces, we would read the great books, like just the books of hadith. We would just go through them and just read them straight through, and then everyone would celebrate and make dua at the end. And at least they heard, all of Bukhari and all of Muslim, and they just grew up in their life hearing those things. Now, you might want to do something like that, and people will criticize you. Why do we have to do that? We should read Quran, or we shouldn't do that in public, or people will start to argue with the basics.
Right.
Nobody in the West would argue that Shakespeare is important, or that, you know, a Shakespeare play is a good thing. And there are many cities, like in London, in Washington, New York, that there are houses dedicated to reviving the performance of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Now, maybe not everyone's going to get it and approve it, but there's not going to be a attack on the concept of itself. So I think that there are mechanisms, and literature and poetry and the performing arts, I think, is a way of connecting in the Western world, connecting these meanings to the public. Furthermore, in the ancient world, there were these axioms that just people had memorized that came from, you know, either Pythagoras or Plato or something like that. And those were, you know, like, know thyself, you know, those are just common statements that people said. But that statement, behind that statement, is a mountain of philosophical work and commentary. And no one criticized that. They respected that that's what's authoritative. And it's all summarized in know thyself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the Muslim world, we're criticizing the know thyself. That's how debased things have become. So I think you're right, but I think there's also the public aspect to it that kind of links us to that tradition.
And also, again, to be merciful on all of us for having these very attitudes where we're questioning these things which were settled, and we're living in an age where the Weltanschauung, the spirit of the age, the worldview, gives us these attitudes. It is an anti-authority world we live in. It's a kind of, you know, post Foucaultian world where we are suspicious and skeptical of everything. You know, the power structures behind things. We question everything. This is because it's part of the atmosphere we breathe. It's not like individuals have this bad attitude. It's the way we are brainwashed or socialized into this set of attitudes. And this worldview has a very distinct genealogy that goes back in time. We can trace the intellectual origins of this to various thinkers and philosophers. I mentioned Foucault. We can go back to Nietzsche. You know, we can, and so on. And so this is not accidental. You know, the rot, I would argue, started from the top, and kind of filtered down through culture, through journalists, through media. And now it's become the axiom of our time. And my only hope in this is that these intellectual fashions do change, particularly in the West. We go through these endless fashions, political fashions like the Marxism, communism, fascism, liberal democracy, you know, royalism, republicanism, Christianity, and now secularism. We're always trying to reinvent ourselves as something else and something new. Maybe this is the answer now. And I think what I'm trying to say in all this is that this phase we're in, I think, will pass because it is quite empty. It doesn't lead anywhere. It has no deep roots. So I'm optimistic in the longer term that our species will move beyond this, and inshallah, Islam becoming the world's #1 religion in terms of numbers anyway, will have a huge impact on this in terms of restoring us to health, mental, spiritual health, having been just dragged down into nihilism by the prevailing zeitgeist. So I'm quite optimistic that our fitra, if it's not too damaged, will enable us to prevail against this madness around, the madness of, you know, come on, say it on YouTube, you know, things like trans or whatever, which Trump is now reacting against very much. I mean, I read, was it yesterday or today, that he is the first decree that's going to be enacted on this first day of office is going to get rid of all the trans in the military in America. All of them, they're going to be kicked out. And, you know, that going down that rabbit hole, you know, there is a reaction. And I think we're not in a static position. We're in a very fluid position. And so some of these issues, I think, hopefully in the future will not be as acutely problematic as they are now anyway.
You know, as we say, Allah alam, Allah knows.
Exactly.
Knows that we always hope for the best, and we're optimistic as believers. You bring up an important point about, you know, Islam becoming, at least numerically, the #1 religion, which is, you know, just we're sort of on the cusp of that already.
Yeah.
And with that will come its challenges. And one of the challenges is that I think because English still remains the predominant language on earth, you know, the lingua franca, it probably will remain so for at least the next, you know, 30, 50 years, I guess. I don't know, Allah alam. But articulating a coherent Islam in English is also going to be also important.
Yes.
Part of that. And that's why, coming back to the topic that brought us together, something like Shakespeare and correct words and literature You know, that's also part of it. We don't want Islam to be this dominant force and be a negative dominant force in the world. So we need to be able to articulate our beliefs and our, you know, as you said, our fitra, and express that in the way that's the most attractive, the most coherent, at least in this case, in the English language. And also that means us as Muslims reviving our tradition and holding to our tradition, our canon, you know, the things that we have that brought us greatness in the past are the same things that are going to bring us greatness today. It's not like there's another set of things that we have. It's the fact that we've left a lot of that tradition and we just sort of discarded it, thinking that we'll find something new that we fumbled. In addition to geopolitical and economic issues, I mean, I'm not unaware of those, but I meant from a paradigmatic point of view, that's also important. So, inshallah, as we say, inshallah, what you say is happens, and the future is better than the past.
Yeah, no, just finally, I just remind you about very good writing in English about Islam, and there's precious little of it, but it does exist. For example, the writings of Guy Eaton, I often mention him. For example, his book, Islam and the Destiny of Man. When I read that book, I was a Christian when I began reading it. When I finished reading it, in my heart anyway, I become a Muslim. But he writes the most exquisite and elegant prose in the service of spiritual truth, and he was a Sunni Muslim. So his ability to write a superb English, I think, is unsurpassed. Another one would be Tim Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad at Cambridge University and Cambridge Muslim College. His English is extremely elevated and not always easy to understand, not because he's obscure, but sometimes he is, but because he writes at a very high level. So in his own way, he is a master of English prose as well. So that's two Englishmen. I keep on about Englishmen, but there are others, but there are a handful of surpassing English writers in the Islamic tradition in the West. And English itself is becoming a language of Islam. It already has become that. I mean, when I was in Texas recently, there's a scholar there, an American scholar who's doing academic research in the Hadith, actually, in English. And it's going to be translated into Arabic. So this has been, starting Texas, ending up in the Arab world. And this is great. I'm not saying that English will be it's perhaps always going to be Arabic, because obviously it's the language of the Prophet, the language of the Quran, and so on, the language of revelation. So, but nevertheless, I think English will become, if not already, a language of Islamic scholarship. And that's great.
I mean, it always has to be Arabic, of course, as you said, because that's the language of revelation. So people that are going to do their work in English have the dual challenge of having to master the Arabic and the English.
Yes,
that is the case. But that doesn't mean that English can't be a vehicle for expressing and articulating and explaining and commenting. And that's very important. And I have found when you get into the depths of the English language, it's very capable of doing it. I mean, I have next to me here, you can't see it, but the Oxford English Dictionary, it's 22 volumes. And wow. When you get into that, wow, it's just, man, the English has some deep depth to it and a very richness to the words. Paul, this is completely off topic, but let me ask you a question, because I don't know why, something you said made me think about it. Do you read Tolkien?
I have done, yeah, of course. I mean, yes, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, etc. Yeah. Why do you ask?
I don't know, something you said, I can't remember what the phrase was, but something reminded me. I think you were talking about Englishmen who write well, and I was just thinking,
Tolkien, of course, is great. But I mean, okay, there's an example. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, obviously, is famous for the movie. Won goodness knows how many dozens of Oscars, and rightly so. It's an amazing movie. And I read the book beforehand, and I've read it since. This incredibly long book, Lord of the Rings. But having read it, I was aware when I first read it, where Tolkien articulates the problem of evil, and the ring and Mordor and the Dark Lord and so on, and because the novel is much richer and deeper than the movies, inevitably. Apologies. And one of the things that struck me when I read it, having read from the Western tradition before that, say like Augustine, the 5th century father of the Christian church, hugely influential in the West, still very influential today, that I immediately recognized what Tolkien was doing. He was articulating what's known in the trade as Augustinian theodicy. So what I mean is this: evil in itself for Tolkien and for Augustine, where he got it from, because Tolkien was a Catholic. I mean, this was deliberate. It wasn't an accident. For these people, evil has no ontology of its own. It doesn't have a positive existence. Like you see in Hollywood movies, like, Dracula is just evil and Satan's just evil. That's not what they believe. They believe that it's a deprivation of the good. So in the absence of good, the will turned away from the good, it becomes evil. But has no intrinsic nature or property as evil. And so that's what you had with the Dark Lord. You had someone who had turned away from the good to the dark side, to use a different some Star Wars, but it didn't have. Well, it's a philosophical point here. It's not like you have a good God and you have evil devil, as if they were twin metaphysical powers with a very different nature of their being. Different. No. Satan was in Christianity. Satan is a fallen angel. Evil has no intrinsic property of its own. It's simply the absence of good. And I thought, and I recognize that because I had done other reading before. So the point is that reading Tolkien can be enriched by a knowledge of, say, Christian theology, which is still very important, I think. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about that overlap, or that where
No, that's useful. So I had not thought of that overlap. I mean, of course, everyone is aware of Tolkien's, very Catholic, very much he was a Catholic and practicing and whatnot. I was mentioning it for just a very silly reason, which is I've noticed a resurgence in entrance of Tolkien.
Oh, right.
I read The Hobbit. I remember reading it to my eldest son before we saw the movies. Unfortunately, I saw the Lord of the movies before I read the Lord of the Rings, and I've since read the Silmarillion. And I've actually used concepts of that in like an Eid khutbah and things like that. And I found that the audience, especially the younger people, resonated very well with them. So I've noticed that there's just a resurgence of interest in Tolkien that I think as Muslims, it's also something that maybe for another time for us to think about talking about. I mean, to your point about the Augustinian theology, I mean, Frodo is sympathetic to Gollum at the end. And it's sort of like he redeemed himself kind of at the end because he was the agent that caused the ring to be destroyed. So I can see that. And then that's very similar to us because Satan was a jinn or is a jinn that just turned away from obedience. So it's a very similar thing. But anyway, he's very impactful, I think, even amongst Muslims. And I think Muslims read Tolkien, young people especially, and almost feel like he must have been influenced by Islam because, I mean, there's just so many Islamic themes. I just think he was a person of faith.
No, I don't think he was influenced by Islam at all. I know a bit about his biography, but I think that there is. I have been a Christian myself, a Catholic before I became a Muslim. There is a huge amount of overlap, actually, at a deep level. I mean, we Catholics and Muslims both believe in one God. They both believe in heaven and hell, the afterlife. Jesus was.
I think that's where the overlap is. It's not that he was.
Now there are differences, obviously the Trinity and so on, but it's like the iceberg. We notice the difference at the top, but actually there's a huge amount of commonality. And when it comes to spirituality at the deep level that Tolkien is talking about, because in Lord of the Rings, God is never mentioned. The word God doesn't exist in Lord of the Rings. It's really weird. And yet his work is suffused with spirituality. And that spirituality, I mean, he did this deliberately. I mean, this is no accident. It suffused his work. And so Muslims are going to resonate with that because he never mentions Jesus. He never mentions God. There's no like atonement theory or Jesus dying on the cross for your sins.
Or there's no prayer, for example.
I guess there isn't. But there is a sense, nevertheless, of good and evil. And redemption, which you mentioned with Gollum at the end. Gollum wasn't just crushed when even then maybe his redemption might happen. And these are Christian/Muslim themes, I would suggest. And so they're going to appeal to everyone. And that's why many younger people, if it's the case, like him, because he offers a perspective or a feeling about life which transcends consumerism, crass materialism, the superficiality of our age. There's something deep in Tolkien which we can pick up, and it resonates with our fitra. So
Tolkien is interesting vis-a-vis the discussion also of the canon, because he's not part of the canon. I mean, a lot of Catholics want him to be part of the canon. I don't
really do.
And I think even people like Bloom, I think it was Bloom who criticized, he said, I think reading Tolkien was like reading the Book of Mormons, which is very disparaging.
Did he say that? Oh dear. Okay.
I think he said something along those lines. But here's a person that is too early to be considered part of the canon, but highly, highly influential. And I think a lot of his writing is very good. I mean, I read the Silmarillion last year right before Ramadan. I mean, I really, really enjoyed reading that. And I look forward to reading, some of the other things and rereading The Lord of the Rings. So again, another voice that's, I think, some not part of the canon, but also influential and something to consider.
Yeah, indeed. Gosh, we ended up from Shakespeare to Tolkien. I didn't expect that. No, that's great, and I'm sure he wouldn't have minded Tolkien. I mean, if we'd done that. Well, perhaps we might conclude it there. We could go on for hours, of course, and maybe another time, inshallah, we will continue from a different platform, a different subject topic. But
no, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. You end up reading these things, and sometimes you think you're just by yourself. So it's always nice to connect with somebody.
It can be a very lonely experience, actually, because but nevertheless, it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to talk to you. So, and
likewise,
really enjoyed it, and I hope our fellow listeners and watchers can also benefit from some of the books that we have treasured ourselves. These are classics for a reason. They are timelessly appealing. They're constantly enriching the human race with their with their absolute genius. So do sample them. Wherever you don't have to start from you don't have to start with Plato. You don't even have to start with Shakespeare. Read Tolkien if you've not read him yet, or read Middlemarch by George Eliot. I mentioned that. It's an absolute amazing work. And we didn't mention a whole host of we didn't mention Dickens. I mean, there's so much we didn't talk about. Anyway, as I say, we'll be here all night if we did. So thank you very much, Dr. Tarek.
Thank you very much.
Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Take care.